Dr. Lynn Fletcher completed her BA in Biological Sciences at Mount Holyoke College. She went on to complete her PhD at Cornell University in the Department of Neurobiology and Behavior. Her dissertation title was Group Living and Vibrational Communication in Larvae of an Australian Sawfly, Perga affinis. After a postdoc at Cornell and a visiting professor position in Indiana, she came and joined us here at Salem State. She teaches entomology, behavioral ecology, ecology and the environment, as well as a non-majors course, human and social biology, a course that developed this festival. I don't know why I'm out of breath. Dr. Fletcher is passionate about the living world, especially those with 6 legs. I think they're called insects. And she's committed to envisioning a positive future where humans can reclaim our position as stewards rather than dominators of the world around us. Her talk today is entitled Evolving Worldviews and Their Impacts, Bringing an Indigenous Perspective. Welcome, Dr. Fletcher.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and I just want to make sure, can everybody hear me in other parts? Okay, excellent. Well, it's a real honor to be speaking at the Darwin Festival, and I want to thank everybody that's put in so much effort in creating this festival, from Virginia Kevel, who started it, and Sue Case, who ran it for 19 years, amazingly, and then everybody who stepped up since to help run the Darwin Festival, and this year Jason Brown and Ethel Gordon being co-chairs, and everybody else who helps to set this up. This is it's a year-long project, getting the Darwin Festival going, and so it's a real honor to be here. And as you can see, I'll be speaking about worldviews and their impacts and Indigenous perspectives. And I also have some nice turtles on this slide, and I do love turtles, but there is a reason why I have turtles. And that is because the perspectives from which I'll be speaking with today are predominantly North America Indigenous peoples, and many Indigenous tribes and nations in North America refer to North America as Turtle Island. And so, hence, most of the artwork that I have in here is from Indigenous people's artwork, and here's some artwork of Turtle Island. All right, so, and I will also start with a land acknowledgement, just saying that, Salem State is occupied by part of Namkeg, which is the ancestral and traditional homeland of the Pawtucket, which are part of the Massachusetts tribe. And so most of us here are probably of the settler community, on this land, and just acknowledging that this land was inhabited before the settler community arrived. I'll also start with an introduction of myself. I know many people in here, but not everyone. And I am a lover of the natural world, so my happy place is being outside in all seasons. And yeah, I love insects, as has been said, but I just love observing. There's so much beauty out there, even when it's cold. So you have some winter pictures there too. There's just so much to explore, and that's really why I went into the field of biology, for my love of the natural world. And it's a great honor to be here at Salem State, teaching what I love, and also working with the students here. It's a real honor to work with the Salem State students. I also feel humbled and honored to be asked to talk today. I am clearly a white woman of settler origin, so I am a student of Indigenous knowledge, and it is a real passion of mine. I was first introduced to this when I was an undergraduate, so in your shoes. I had read a book that was about Aboriginal peoples and their culture in Australia, and honestly, I hope it's different today, but in my day I hadn't learned about any of these thoughts and ways of living and societies in my K through 12, and it was really moving, because I was being introduced to a worldview and societies that had these incredible, like, a relationship with the world around them that was of full of respect and reciprocity, and who cared. And it was very different from the worldview that I felt that I was living in, and I didn't realize that there were whole societies that shared this worldview. So from that time, it's been of interest of mine. So this is, clearly I love our planet, and I share this with my students, and because I think we do live on an amazing planet. It's the only one we know where there's life, at least life as we know it. And there's so much of that life. Like, it's so diverse, right? From the insects, so the 6-leggeds, the 2-leggeds like us, 4-leggeds, 8-leggeds. But then there's, finned, everything living in the water, single-celled organisms, things underground, trees which span ground and air. I mean, and then, we have terrestrial and aquatic. And I just, we are privileged to share this journey of our life on a planet full of such diverse beings. And wherever you go, you can, whether it's like looking at little things, like I had that picture showed the bud of a red horse chestnut. I mean, it's beautiful. It's small. So at the macroscopic and the microscopic and macroscopic, you can get feelings of awe in our world, and it's this feelings of expansiveness, and yet at the same time we live in this world of incredible beauty, incredible abundance. We are also cognizant of today's ecological crisis, right? And kind of there's this diminishment of life occurring. And that leads, there's a lot of terms and things that we know that are going on. And it leads, we go from the state of expansion to kind of a contraction, because it's sad, right? And it's overwhelming. Like, there's all these things happening, and it's like, but I love our planet, and I don't want this to be happening, and it's happening, and but why is it happening, right? So we might be asking ourselves, like, how did we get here? Like, we haven't even been on the planet that long, like, as a species, right? So, like, why is this happening? And then, so we're already kind of in the state of like, oh my God, and then we hear like, oh, well, we're in the Anthropocene, and this is, geologists around the world have agreed that we are now in a new era, the Anthropocene, and it's, defined as a period in which human influence is dominant, both on the climate and the land and the water, right, in the environment. And as you can see from the picture, it's not in a positive way, right? So again, we can still get smaller, and it's like, but my main message today is like, this is not what it has to be, right? We think of humans, because we see this, like, as having a negative impact, and we have been having a negative impact, but not all humans have a negative impact, and not all ways of living have a negative impact. And so this does not have to be our legacy. Like, it's a current trajectory that if we don't change anything, but we have choices, and but we may not be aware of these choices. And one woman who is I respect her tremendously. I bring her into my classes, Robin Wall-Kamir. She's well known, but she is a citizen of the Potawatomi Nation, part of the larger Anishinaabe people, and she is also a scientist and botanist, and so she bridges both worlds of Western science and Indigenous knowledge. And she speaks and writes prolifically, and one of her famous books is Braiding Sweetgrass. But she also teaches, and this is a quote from her, as she also asks her students about, like, well, what kind of impacts do humans have on the planet? And they all think of negative ones. And she's like, how can we begin, to move towards ecological and cultural sustainability if we don't know what it looks like, right? If all that we see around us, all we've ever known is this idea of humans having a negative impact, it's hard to envision something different. And so that's where we're coming in today. So my main goal for today's talk is that humanity has a choice in our legacy, and yes, we have a choice. We have agency, and then we'll be looking at kind of a comparison of different worldviews. So looking at the Western worldview and Indigenous worldview, and then we'll be delving into the Indigenous perspective and worldview, which is also referred to as traditional ecological knowledge, giving some examples of stories and some examples of their teachings in action, and then pathways forward. So that's the trajectory of the talk today. All right, so I thought we'd start off with a historical perspective back in the 1500s, and you can see we're looking at North America and Europe. And at that time, we had about 40 million people living in North America and 50 million people living in Europe. And in both places, you see nations, complex economies and societies, governments. You might not have heard about that happening in North America, but they were here and existing just like they were in Europe. So this was happening in both places, yet the natural world was very different in both places. So again, this is just an example of one of the descriptions of, prior to Columbus, so a little before the 1500s, Europe was experiencing extreme wood scarcity. And if you're experiencing extreme wood scarcity, you're probably experiencing scarcity in a lot of other things because many things rely on plants. Whereas when settlers, right, so in this time you have European people starting to explore North America. When they came here, they could not believe the abundance here in North America and were literally dumbfounded. Like, that's some of the vocabulary used to describe it. And they would write back to their friends and family in Europe to describe what they were seeing. And I'll just give some examples of some of these quotes. So here we have about fish and oops. So the abundance of sea fish are almost beyond believing. Sure, I should scarce have believed it, except that I had seen it with mine own eyes. Right? And it's true that people, when they wrote to people in Europe, they did not believe them. They could not send pictures, right, or videos or whatever. So like, I can't believe you. And but the accounts kept coming. And here's another one of somebody saying the fish were so thick that they might be able to walk on their backs, right? And they said the same thing about birds, right? Passenger pigeons were alive at the time, and they could blanket the sky and block out the sun. I mean, they're just, they also talked about larger animals. So beast, bears, deer, wolves, foxes, beavers, otters, martens, wild goats, moose, etc. 100 deers in the space of a mile. So a lot of more diversity and abundance. And they also were interested in trees, given that they had scarcity of trees, and noted that there was an abundance of this resource, right, from Maine to the Hudson Woods. And this other thing showed up in several correspondences, that they were remarkably open and park-like. And even, we have another explorer here, Verrazano in Narragansett Bay wrote kind of a similar thing, that the forests are so open in the undergrowth that they could be traversed easily by large armies. Little did they realize that they were actually, these were examples of managed ecosystems, right? So indigenous people would use fire to manage the undergrowth. This would help, it would basically stimulate the growth of some plants that would help bring in prey animals, but you could see the prey animals, so it was like a win-win. It helped some other species survive, and it was also helping them to collect prey. But the European eyes did not see that. So the point here is humans can be benefactors, right, of the land, and we see this in this historical setting. So the abundance that we saw is not due to the lack of humans, but due to the relationship they had with the land, which was different. And right, so again, this is from Cronin, and he wrote a book, Changes in the Land. Like, we are not comparing two landscapes, one with and without humans. We are comparing two ways of living. Right? Whereas one, you're belonging to an ecosystem. So So yes, humans can have a positive impact. All right, and so just introducing the traditional ecological knowledge as what is this? So it is a very large body of knowledge, right, of practices and beliefs and relationships with living beings, and the environment. These are built over long periods of time. So it's empirical, place-based knowledge built over millennia, and it's very detailed, right? Because if you've lived in an area for a long time and you're passing on this information from generation to generation, there's a lot of information that builds up over time. And much of this information was transmitted via stories. And I mean, if you look at, social media is basically telling stories, and it's another way of telling stories, but we are built for stories. We remember things more with stories, and you can pack in a lot. You can pack values, you can pack ecological information. There's just a lot that can be packed in. And I want to acknowledge, right, there were so many different nations, and so there's a lot of diversity, but despite the diversity, the traditional ecological knowledge is united by shared philosophies and concepts, and this is not some Western anthropologist saying this, but these are Indigenous people themselves saying that yes, they share core values, and that's why, in this talk I can talk about, they create a similar worldview, so I can talk about a kind of an Indigenous worldview compared with a Western society worldview. And again, worldviews are important because they shape our values, actions, and how we relate to each other. And they're often invisible, right? If you haven't been exposed to another worldview, you might not really know that you're operating within one. Just like if this goldfish has lived a good life and has always been in water, then it might not be aware of the water per se comparison to air, like another type of environment. And so you could think of worldviews being the same. If you live in one, you might not be aware of others unless you've traveled or met, other people. And so we'll talk just a little bit about some of these differences. Again, just from that history, I think the Indigenous worldview on one side, you could say is more biocentric, kincentric, and we'll talk about some of the values held, whereas the Western society worldview is more anthropocentric, hierarchical, as you can see. So when I talk about biocentric, kincentric, I'm talking about the Indigenous worldview and Western society worldview, and relating to anthropocentric, so they're kind of synonymous. All right, so there are some differences that I want to highlight, and I'll start here. So again, in a biocentric, as you can kind of just see from the visual, humans are part of a larger whole, and Western science also recognizes we are a young species, right, 300,000 years old compared to others. But in the biocentric or kincentric view, that leads to humility, which we don't see on the other side at all. There's really a culture of assumed superiority as well as domination, and it is very hierarchical. Another thing is that, there's respect and responsibility with the world around, right? So there's this idea of the land as well as other more than human beings being relatives, and hence you would treat your relatives with respect and also with responsibility, especially if you have to consume some of them or use some of them for food. You're going to be more respectful. Whereas on the other side, right, if you're seeing land, water, and animals, including humans, I want to add, right, it depends, are seen as resources and are more commodified. Then, right, so this side is kind of leading to reciprocal life-sustaining relationships. These are with the animate world, so it's with the people in the world, but with also the more than human animate world. And you're going to be guided by ethics as well as gratitude for what you're being given, versus an extractive relationship, right? If things are, if the world around you are objects and things, you can take what you can without really thought of what you give back, right? So it's more extractive. And then, again, one is more very deep place-based knowledge, ancestral ties to the land, which is cultivated over long periods of time. Whereas on the other side, if you don't have that, I mean, some people stay in the same place for a while, but it really is rooted in colonialism, right? You're going to more places, and that's part of extractivism. You can't extract in one place forever. You have to keep going other places. And you're not going to develop that tie over long periods of time. So I have one more to add, but I'll just say from right here, you can see this, I guess it's your right. Not mine, but this is more control-based, more centered in the mind. There's more heart in here. It's more relationship. I mean, and Indigenous people, they talk about 4 ways of knowing, which include spiritual, emotional, intellectual, and physical. And they're all equally valued. Whereas we certainly have those things in our society, but we really highly value intellect and the mind, and sometimes to our detriment, right? Where we aren't really letting the heart shine as much. All right, and then my last bullet point in comparison is, again, this is kind of a summary, right? You see yourself as part of more of a community, right? And so, again, cooperation and reciprocity will be emphasized, versus in Western society, and it varies, but we are more focused on individuality, right? And this does then bring out more competition as kind of, it's more common, it's highlighted, I guess is what I said. That's what I said. I guess that's what I meant. Yes, it's highlighted. And because we're at the Darwin Festival, I want to just say a little bit about that last one. In relation to, right, this is the Western worldview, but then in Western science. So there is an emphasis on competition in Western scientific thinking. And Darwin, who we're celebrating today, happy birthday, right, he wasn't the only one who came up with this theory of natural selection, but he was a great proponent of it, Alfred Wallace as well. But it is a wonderful concept. It helps us unite, or it's like the umbrella of understanding the diversity of life, and natural selection is an excellent mechanism for evolution. And Darwin and Western science all came about within a particular worldview, the Western worldview, and there does tend to be an emphasis or a focus on competition. And competition is important, right? It does shape a lot. Yet I want to point out that cooperation is very important too. And I'll just give one example from a Western framework, and then we'll get into traditional values, ecological values. But some of you may have heard of Suzanne Simard. She became more well known with her book published in 2021, Finding the Mother Tree. But she came from a family of foresters, right? And she became a forester herself, and then an ecologist and an academic. When her grandfather and father forested, they would take down a tree here or there. But by the time she was in forestry, and unfortunately this practice is what is still done today, it was clear cutting. And not only clear cutting, you then spray the ground to get rid of any other plants and herbs and stuff that will come up. And then you replant, but you replant monocultures of the trees you want. And then they're growing in like sunlight, and they dry out and they die because there's nothing to shade them. And And it just doesn't work very well. but the reason why they're doing that is because, well, we don't want any competition, right? We don't want other herbs and species competing with the plants we want in our forests. Whereas Suzanne Simard, her work is really like this finding the mother tree, is that these large trees, I mean, there's so much she's done and other people since, but they actually support their kin, their younger trees, as they're starting to grow. They send carbon. They do that through fungal networks underground. But not only their own kin and species, they help other species. So there's interspecies cooperation going on. Obviously with the fungi, it's a different species, but other species of trees. And it's an incredibly complex network that helps the whole forest survive. And she has also worked with Indigenous people who have, by the way, noticed these relationships before, and now they're being, recognized with Western science, but she's like, okay, this was knowledge that was known before. So my point with this then is just that we, in general, we find what we're looking for. So if we're focused on competition, that's what we're going to see. But cooperation is out there, and so we benefit by expanding perspectives and including perspectives. All right. So back to our biocentric and Indigenous worldview, and I had mentioned that stories are important, and they, again, contain a tremendous amount of information, ecological information, but they can also transmit values. And so I'm just going to share, there's so many stories, but to keep it short, one today, and I've shared this with my students, is one story that kind of encompasses the values of this worldview. And this was shared by Robin Wellcomere. It's a creation story of her people, and it's called The Story of Sky Woman, where, again, creation stories give these, the values, provide values. So in the story of Sky Woman, the idea is that there's this world, and it was a dark world full of water. There were animals that lived in the water and on the water. And then one day, there was a hole in the sky, and light came through. But not only light, there was a woman who was falling. And as she was falling to the water, the animals were like, oh no, we have to help her, and she can't just fall to the water. So it was the geese who came and offered to basically help her fall more, catch her and bring her to the water. So this is another piece of artwork that shows Sky Woman being held by the geese as she is coming to the water. But the animals realized she cannot live in the water, and so this turtle arrives and says, well, we can use my back and create land, but to create land we need mud, and so we need to get mud from the bottom of the water. And so there were a bunch of animals that volunteered to dive, but it was so deep they couldn't make it. But the lowly muskrat, or I shouldn't say lowly, but I should say the humble muskrat, the answer is through really following the guidelines of the honorable harvest, which basically engenders all of these values, but it's an oral tradition, just like you don't take more than you need, only ask for permission, give back, right? If there's only one left, there's not enough to take, right, and so forth. So it's just really kind of taking with respect and giving back. So, first example I want to talk about are in relation to coastal nations and also people that live near other waterways, so fresh water, and look at one of the ways that they would, right, if we are heterotrophs, so they would eat fish, but they did so in a way that was a really ingenious method with fishing weirs. And I just want to also highlight that this requires really intimate knowledge of both the fish and the tides. So, in Western science, you can get a PhD and study for 6 years of something, or maybe you have a whole career of 30 years you're studying something, but that pales in comparison to like generations of place-based knowledge. And that's what, you know, these people had and have. And we have examples of long, you know, really old examples of fishing weir infrastructure that date back, you know, many thousands, over 5,000, almost 6,000 years old in some places, including in Boston. And this is based on research done up in the Vancouver area of the Khmer people. And I'm just going to show you an example of how a tidal fishing weir would work. This video link works.
The Comox built the frame of the fish traps by pounding long poles, Douglas fir saplings for instance, into the tidal flats. They lashed woven panels to the poles to act as fences and designed to lead the fish into the traps at high tide. Once inside, fish couldn't find the exit. As the tide receded, fish would seek deep water, which kept them inside the trap. Once the tide was out, fishers could walk inside and...
Pretty cool method. I mean, it makes it easier on them. I mean, you have to build it. But you're also not, you know, you take what you need and then you let the rest go. So this really does, you know, emphasize the honorable harvest and that they are, again, taking what they needed and they're not harming the fish. I mean, obviously the fish they catch, they're going to eat, but there's not harm to other fish, you know, from bycatch and trawling and so forth. And also you can have weirs. So this is one. There are lots of different varieties of weirs, but you can have weirs where, you know, smaller fish would be able to go through, so you would only be catching like the larger fish. And I just want to mention that this is the Massachusetts tribe lives on a coastal area, and they used fishing weirs and continue today to revitalize this technology through outreach and education. This is Thomas Green. If any of you have heard him speak, he was here during Indigenous Peoples Month in November. Great person and advocate for you know, the knowledge of these people, and it's wonderful that he shares it. All right, another example are the Menominee, and they're considered a people of trees. 3 examples, this is number 2. And they are known even by other tribes as the ancient ones because they've been around in this area of Wisconsin for over 12,000 years. Obviously there was ice there during the glaciers, but once the glaciers receded, the trees became really important to them. And so the trees were important infrastructure for their housing. They lived near Wisconsin. Is that the one with the land of 1,000 lakes? I always get confused. But anyways, there's a lot of water, right? There's all the Great Lakes. So they use canoes, and then they get their food right from the forests. So the forests are very important to them, and they sustain the forest for, you know, thousands of years. But like many indigenous people, most of their land was taken away from them, except for a small piece. And this was in 1848 when Wisconsin became a state. So for thousands of years, they had lived on this land using the wood, and it was forested. In less than 30 years, the land that had been taken from them was completely deforested, right? So you have the settlers coming in and using the land and the wood, but in a way that is very, very different. The good news is that, you know, well, this is a quote from the chief at the time that was living at the time when Wisconsin became a state, but he said, the Menominee know how to harvest forests, the trees will last forever, right? So again, they knew how to live and maintain this ecosystem as well as make use of it. And the good news is that, you know, the Menominee still live there. They did retain some of their land, and they are a shining example of, right, they are still harvesting the wood. They've harvested over 2 billion board feet in the less than 200 years, and yet, right, 90% of the land is still forested. They are healthy. They still have old growth trees. They're not a monoculture. They have diversity. And there's more trees there now than there were in 1854. Very different, right? So clearly you can make use of trees and have a positive impact at the same time. And therefore they become very, people are like, how do you do this? We would like to do this. But it's, again, they're clear that it's not a silver bullet or a magic bullet, right? So people come here looking for a magic bullet. It's not like you do one thing, right? It's how they're living with the land and their relationship with the world around them, right? We believe that we are part of the land, whereas others, right, they own the land, and that leads to very different outcomes. Again, trees aren't just trees, we have a relationship with our world. And so it's really seeing how that perspective leads to a very different outcome. All right, one last example is, again, just the use of resources. This is sweetgrass, which is used by many Indigenous people in ceremonies and creating baskets. It's the Anishinaabe is a large area. This goes up into Canada, the Anishinaabe people. Might have been some of the seeds from Sky Woman, and again used in ceremonies and baskets. The Mohawk people noticed that there were populations of sweetgrass that were declining. However, the populations that were close to their settlement were really healthy, and they thought this seems to reflect one of our sayings, which is that if you don't use it, it will go away. If we use it respectfully, though, it will stay and flourish. And Kamira, who is also an ecologist, right, decided to study traditional harvesting methods and see if this was indeed true. So they looked at the effects of two harvesting methods and compared it with control where there was no harvesting, right? So two different methods, but in both cases, right, they never removed more than 50% of the plants. And they looked at the results. So the harvested plots fared much better than the control, so they had 80% more shoots, whereas the control plots declined. So it's like they were stimulating growth through their harvesting, and they weren't over-harvesting, right? So they got the sweetgrass did well, and if they weren't there, the sweetgrass was not doing so well. So the emphasis is, right, people and traditional methods can have a positive effect on nature. Another example of that. And just some implications of this is that, we've set up national parks in the United States, which are a great resource, but in the process, the federal government has often made it so that Indigenous people did not have access to these lands, even if they were their traditional lands. So Acadia National Park used to be part of the lands of the Wabanaki, and they used that for resources as well as getting sweetgrass. And access is now being restored, for them to be able to harvest the sweetgrass. So that is great, right? It's unfortunate sometimes that it takes scientific study to show what they've shown for millennia, but at least they're getting access. All right. So ways of moving forward, right? So we see this Indigenous worldview, biocentric, concentric worldview. How do we move forward? And we live in a society that is more a Western focus, but are there ways that we can bring in what is being referred to as two-eyed seeing? So bring in kind of the best of both and how they might work together. One of the metaphors that is used in this involves the three sisters, which is a traditional planting method in Indigenous cultures, where instead of monocultures, you plant corn, beans, and squash together, and they all help each other because the corn provides a stock for the beans to grow, because they like to grow on something, and the squash provides shade and moisture, keeps the moisture in the soil and blocks out weeds. And so all three of these like help each other. And the idea is that in this, the analogy then, or metaphor, would be that corn could be like indigenous knowledge, right? It provides the stock of morals and ethics and guidelines, whereas Western science is full of curiosity and has all these amazing tools to explore the natural world, but we can be guided, right, in how we do that and do it ethically. And the squash could be, institutions that support learning and so forth. So, and this isn't just hypothetical, which is exciting, and that UMass Amherst in 2023 got a $30 million grant to create the Center for grading Indigenous knowledge and science. So and it's not just at UMass, so they have hubs throughout the United States as well as in other places around the world. And I did check in with them before this talk, and I was like, how's it going for funding? And they said, we are still funded, so yeah. That's really good news. And with all this, we know, okay, this is just a statistic that I show also in my classes, but Indigenous people, unfortunately, their numbers have gotten smaller as through colonization, and yet they persist. Like they have, for long periods of time, incredibly resilient, and despite their smaller numbers, right, 80% of the world's biodiversity is safeguarded by indigenous communities. I mean, that tells us they're doing something different. Like, if nothing else has said that, right, like history tells us they've done something different, this tells us they've done something different, all these examples, like, there's a lot for us to learn here. And I'll just end with this idea of the seventh fire prophecy, which is also highlighting the main message that humanity has a choice for a legacy. So in the Potawatomi as well as the Anishinaabe people, so the Potawatomi are a smaller group within it, there have been what they call different fire prophecies. And these have been prophecies of things that have happened, and they've happened, and they end up being kind of eras of time. Right? So you have the Turtle Island, which is when they started, but there have been many different fire prophecies, and like the fourth fire prophecy was the prophecy, which is, and this is a mural where they gave an animal for the different fire prophecies. The fourth fire prophecy was that a light-skinned people would be coming, and it was unclear if that was going to lead to a more flourishing of ideas and collaboration, or deception and disease and misfortune. We all know what happened at that time, right? And then you have the bear and the muskrat, and these were times of really hard, right? The bear is the sign of the clan, of the family, like staying together to survive. The muskrat, we know, is the symbol of sacrifice, and this is the time when children are being taken away from their families. And now we're in the seventh fire, and they chose an eagle to represent the seventh fire, and the eagle is a symbol of hope. And the idea, the prophecy of the seventh fire is that there will come a time where ancient wisdom will be revitalized. People will go back to learning their languages. People will start getting an interest in ancient wisdom. And at that time, people have a choice, right? Like, to go back and learn from this wisdom and find a new way forward. And if not, like, we know where that goes, but that's the seventh fire prophecy, that we are in that era where we can choose this pathway and this revitalization. And honestly, we are seeing it. I mean, the outside world may tell you one thing, but if you look closely, like, this is happening. And the other cool thing is that there is an eighth fire, and if we get there, the eighth fire is the Rainbow Tribe. It is a time of peace. It is a time of unity. And we have to go through the seventh fire to get there. So I hope this gives me a sense of hope. I hope it gives you a sense of hope. Like we can do this. Like we can come together. We can learn from ancient wisdom and work together and find pathways forward and create the future that we all want. So with that, I will thank you and offer tremendous gratitude to the Indigenous people who have offered their wisdom and shared it with colonial or settler people like myself. And thank you very much for coming.
Hello, thanks so much for your talk. I was wondering how we can all, as individuals, do something to help.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we underestimate what we can do as individuals, and I honestly feel like living more heart-centered and caring about the world around you. That includes your family, and it includes the more than human world. And it doesn't take a lot to make a difference. And noticing the beauty around you, and it may seem little, but it spreads. And also learning, I think we can all do more to learn about the Indigenous people who lived and continue to live in areas where settler communities live now. And they have a lot to teach us, what they're willing to teach us. In Newburyport, they've been having an Indigenous people celebration. I went 2 years ago, and I was honestly almost brought to tears by the generosity. There were people that came from Maine, Indigenous people that came from Maine to share their culture with predominantly settlers, like white settlers like myself, and other people in the settler community. And it's just so generous, and let's make use of that opportunity and really value what they are sharing. The resilience that these people have shown is tremendous, and they come with open hearts despite everything they've gone through. So, yeah, thank you.
Wonderful talk. Thank you so much. I recently read a book, When It All Burns. It was written by a man who had gone into the Forest Service as a fire jumper, and so they were fighting all of these horrific fires. And he has come to the realization that we need to learn from Indigenous people on how to use fire to prevent all of these things, these horrible conflagrations. Because fire can be beneficial, and you were pointing it out with the stewardship of the forest.
Yeah, excellent. That's a great point. Yeah, there's so much we have to learn.
That was a great talk. I really appreciated it. What role do you think Indigenous people should play in research? I know a lot of people travel in attempts to get PhDs and are doing research, and often they're going into local communities and Indigenous people's areas. Should they leave and respect their land? Should they cite them as references? What do you think the role is for them in our research?
I think it should be a collaboration, definitely, and it should always be a choice, like their choice, right? Again, we walk this, you don't want appropriation of knowledge. So the thing with UMass, it's all kind of centered around climate resilience, and how can we bring Western science and Indigenous knowledge together in climate resilience. And anybody that's participating are both on board and all will be acknowledged, and that is hugely important. So I think, and the other thing, with Acadia National Park, Indigenous peoples were invited to be on kind of the management level of how we're gonna manage the park, and their voices need to be heard, and that was happening under a different administration, but we need more of that, right? And we're one country and there's the whole world, so yeah, we need more of it to be truly collaborative and to really, their information is tremendously valuable, right? We again come from Western science being the pinnacle, but it's, we have to come at as equals, yeah. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. In my previous career, I studied the social and political implications of behavior change, and I was curious about what you thought of the scientist's role in that, because it turns out it's really politically thorny to tell people to change their behavior. And what we eat turns out to be the biggest factor in altered biogeochemical cycles and land use change. Our burgers, our meat is the #1 driver of land use. I left that field partly because I was so disheartened by my research and what it showed about kind of the implications of people going around informing other people of those things. So yeah, I'm curious what you think the scientist's role is, what you think behavior change could look like for society if it's necessary.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, science provides data. It doesn't always change hearts. So I really, I do, we have a lot of data, and it's the change of heart that we need, and that happens organically. And I do think stories are great. I mean, Jane Goodall was someone I really loved, and but since she passed, I've been reading more of her stuff, as I'm sure a lot of people have. But she uses stories all the time, and then some of the stories she tells of how she could have conversations with people who were dead 180 from her about we're going to use chimpanzees in research, and she will just have a conversation with them. But she comes to them from not a point that you're wrong and I'm right, but getting them to see that chimpanzees are organisms that are social, that feel pain, anyways, and they would be like, oh my God, we're changing this, So I think it's building relationships, honestly, and science, we can have, the data is still important, but let's work on our relationships and creating those connections, I think, and it'll happen kind of from the ground up, I think.